For a few weeks now, farmers in India have been converging outside the capital with a message for the government. They represent a very powerful, very vocal, very frustrated group. Their clashes with police have been violent, even deadly. They've burned effigies of Narendra Modi and his ministers.
Dozens of barricades have been set up. Container walls have been erected. The idea is to stop these farmers from reaching Delhi.
This is actually the second time in just a few years farmers have descended on Delhi in a massive, prolonged protest. And they say the promises made from that last clash haven't been fulfilled. They want more money for their crops. They want debts waived. They want better pensions. They say the government isn't listening.
The tension is one deriving from deep distrust.
But what makes this such a persistent problem in India that the government can't afford not to solve, and yet? Agriculture is by far the biggest sector in India. About half the people in the country work in farming. According to the World Bank in 2022, 43% of the labor force.
There are some 260 million people working as farm workers in India.
Compare that to the biggest agricultural producing countries in the world, China, the United States, Brazil. Their farming labor forces don't come close. But farming in India, by comparison, is inefficient. You see, a big part of India gaining independence from the British in the 40s was about empowering farmers. Land reform. Give the people a way to make a living by giving them land. So even today, a lot of farming in India is family-run, small operations, often less than 2 hectares. That's maybe a couple of football fields.
A lot of farmers, extremely small plots of land, and because they can't achieve economies of scale, they can't grow, they can't modernize, they live on a lot of subsidy programs the government provides.
For many farms, 20% of their income could be subsidies from government. Electricity and water come cheaper. Across the country, there's a government guarantee to buy essential crops like wheat and rice.
They announce new prices every year for the different seasonal crops. What's the floor price the government will promise so that if farmers can't sell certain staples on the open market, that they can at least sell to the government and get an assured price.
This creates a few problems. First, that's an expensive safety net to prop up. Trillions of rupees a year. That's billions of dollars. Not all of that food gets used.
Approximately 40% of the food produced in India is wasted every year due to an inefficient supply chain system.
And that's in a country where about 16% of the population is malnourished. That's more than 200 million people. Meanwhile, those subsidies that needed government support feeds a cycle.
This particular system incentivizes farmers to grow just rice and wheat. So just the lack of diversification is a problem.
So what you end up with is an industry employing nearly half the country, but accounting for just 15% of the country's GDP.
Productivity is low. The yields per acre are low. Yields per worker are extremely low. And they tend to vary enormously in a continental country of our size.
The country's prime minister has been working towards a new direction.
Narendra Modi has promised to build a new India.
India is a developing country, but it wants to turn the page past agriculture.
The aim of the super ambitious exercise was clear: to turn India into a manufacturing hub.
The goal is to make it much more manufacturing, but 10 years has not enabled that to happen.
Now, there have been huge investments in roads and infrastructure. Since Modi became prime minister, India's national highway network has expanded more than 50%.
Over the past 9 years, approximately 50,000 kilometers of new national highways have been added.
Those are construction jobs. And consider manufacturing, Modi's philosophy, summed up by his Make in India campaign. Attract investment, become a hub for creating and assembling things. Everything from engines and wind turbines to semiconductors and infant formula. But it hasn't entirely panned out. You see, one of the main objectives in Modi's plan was to increase the manufacturing sector's portion of GDP from 14% to 25% in a few years.
Today, they're still stuck at 14%. They've made barely a dent despite a couple of pretty good reforms at the national level.
And at least part of this we can trace back to the grip agriculture maintains on the country. I'll let Richard explain.
Because again, this huge pull by farmers and the poor, most state governments have to give away most of the electricity they produce. So for a manufacturer, when you talk about in big cities having 2 or 3 hours of cuts a day, and then if you're outside the big cities, you might have 12 hours of cuts a day, that's unsustainable.
Unsustainable and a big liability for a country trying to attract big industrial investment. Water is another good example. Scarce resource, especially in the north, which is relatively dry. Farmers growing wheat and rice use incredible amounts of water. But for a manufacturer that needs water to operate, you're stuck. So if you don't build factories, there are no factory jobs. If there are no factory jobs, you're probably working the farm.
This economy is in desperate need of pulling workers out of agriculture. But how do you pull workers out of agriculture except by ensuring that you have labor-intensive manufacturing growing and you have construction jobs growing, which is exactly what happened in China. But now China's already there. Vietnam is doing rather well. India is very far behind.
And trying to change the system, last time Modi did that, it led to this.
These farmers are here with a very clear and strong message for the Indian government. They say they will block roads, they will disrupt this government until those 3 controversial farm laws are repealed.
Back in 2020, the government passed 3 bills that were going to upend the farming industry. The basic idea, baby steps for government to get out of the farming business. Give farmers more power to sell their crops to private buyers outside the traditional system, and, the argument went, lift farmer incomes and increase exports.
The measures allowed growers to sell produce beyond government-regulated markets.
But farmers worried this would mean the end of the subsidies and, eventually, those purchase guarantees on crops altogether. Farmers' unions called them the anti-farmer laws.
We'll stay put until we get a written guarantee from the government that the minimum price for our crops won't disappear.
There was also concern that this would lead to corporatization of Indian agriculture in a much larger way than it has happened so far.
Hundreds of thousands of farmers were camped around Delhi for more than a year protesting. And you know what happened? Modi backed down. He repealed the laws.
And he is someone who sees himself as a strongman politician and very rarely makes political U-turns. And that just gives you a sign of just how strong the farmers' voice ended up being.
So now there's a hope for the farmers that their demands are going to be fulfilled now since the farm laws are being repealed.
They're keenly aware of their ability to instill fear in politicians, even politicians as popular as Narendra Modi.
But farmers protesting now say not only have those demands not been met, they have entirely new demands as well. And a pretty clear message. Fix the industry you've got.
Because India is going through this, this slow transformation of an agricultural system where food security was the only goal, and from there the goals have changed.
Just a month or so from now, there will be a general election. Modi and his BJP party really do not want the farmers and their complaints to document public discourse. They do not want to see those headlines of the anger from the farmers, the images of tear gas being used and unleashed against the farmers.